Good afternoon. I'm Carolyn Long. We begin today here with that breaking news. A 31-year-old Kansas City murder case has been solved with advanced DNA testing. We're talking here about the Fawn Cox case. She was just 16 years old when she was raped and murdered inside her own bedroom.
For 31 years, the killer lived as if nothing had happened, while the victim's family unknowingly welcomed him into their lives. 16-year-old Fawn Marie Cox went to bed believing she was safe inside her own home. By sunrise, she was gone. Police searched for a stranger. They questioned suspects. They followed gang leads. They collected evidence they hoped would identify the killer. But every lead collapsed. Every suspect walked free, and the case slowly faded into one of Kansas City's most haunting unsolved murders. For the next 31 years, one question refused to disappear. Who killed Fawn Marie Cox? What investigators didn't realize was that the answer had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. The man responsible didn't flee the city. He didn't change his identity. He didn't disappear. Instead, he quietly returned to everyday life, attending family gatherings, standing beside grieving relatives, and watching as detectives searched everywhere except the one place they never imagined the truth would be. It wasn't a confession that finally exposed him. It wasn't a witness. And it wasn't a lucky break. It was a tiny piece of DNA collected in 1989. Evidence so far ahead of its time that it would sit untouched for decades until science finally caught up. When detectives followed that genetic trail, it led them to a revelation more disturbing than anyone expected. The killer wasn't a stranger. He wasn't a serial predator passing through town. He was someone the family had trusted, someone who knew the house, someone who knew exactly which window would be unlocked, and someone who had spent decades hiding behind a familiar face. Tonight, we're retracing every step of the investigation, from the final hours of Fawn Marie Cox's life to the forensic breakthrough that solved a murder 31 years later. Along the way, we'll uncover the mistakes, the dead ends, the overlooked evidence, and the devastating truth that forever changed one Kansas City family. Because sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones hiding in the shadows. They're the ones you've known all along. Before we begin, if you enjoy well-researched true crime documentaries that focus on real investigations, verified evidence, and the stories behind the headlines, make sure you're subscribed to Midnight True Crime. Every week, we take a deep dive into some of the most fascinating solved and unsolved cases from around the world. Now, let's go back to where this heartbreaking case began. Long before her name became part of a homicide investigation, Fawn Marie Cox was simply a teenager with big dreams and an ordinary life. In the summer of 1989, 16-year-old Fawn lived with her parents, John and Beverly Cox, and her two younger sisters in a modest home on Van Brunt Boulevard in Kansas City, Missouri. It wasn't a wealthy neighborhood, but it was home. Like many working-class families, the Cox family built their lives around hard work, routine, and each other. John spent long hours providing for the family, while Beverly kept everything running at home. Together, they raised 3 daughters in a house filled with love, trust, and the kind of everyday moments most families take for granted. When the girls needed more space as they got older, John and Beverly even gave up their own bedroom upstairs and moved downstairs so their daughters could have more room. It was a simple sacrifice, but one that reflected the kind of parents they were. Fawn, the oldest of the 3 sisters, naturally became someone her younger siblings admired. She was responsible, dependable, and fiercely protective of her family. Her sister Amber would later describe her as someone who always stood up for others, and someone she desperately wanted to be like. To Amber, Fawn wasn't just an older sister. She was a role model. Outside of home, Fawn was focused on building her future. She had recently earned her learner's permit, a milestone that represented far more than simply learning to drive. Like many teenagers, she dreamed of owning her own car, earning her independence, and taking the next step toward adulthood. Every paycheck she earned went into savings, bringing that dream a little closer with every shift she worked. That summer, she had a seasonal job at Worlds of Fun, one of Kansas City's most popular amusement parks. Day after day, she greeted guests, operated the cash register, and quietly saved every dollar she could. It wasn't glamorous work, but Fawn never complained. She understood that achieving her goals meant working for them. Friends remembered her as kind, dependable, and easy to talk to. She enjoyed spending time with her sisters, roller skating on weekends, attending church, and talking about the future with her best friend Donna McGee, who lived directly across the street. Their friendship was the kind that develops after years of growing up together, close enough that they could wave to each other from their bedroom windows. Nothing about July 25, 1989, suggested it would be any different from the countless summer days before it. Fawn reported for another shift at Worlds of Fun, helping customers, counting change, and looking forward to going home after a long day of work. She was tired, but she was also thinking about the future. A future that seemed wide open for a 16-year-old with dreams, determination, and an entire life still ahead of her. What she didn't know was that someone else already knew exactly where she would be that night. Someone who understood the layout of the Cox family home. Someone who knew which bedroom was hers. Someone who knew her family's nightly routine. And before the sun rose the following morning, that knowledge would turn an ordinary summer night into one of Kansas City's most devastating unsolved murders. By the evening of July 25, 1989, nothing seemed out of place inside the Cox family home. It had been another hot Missouri summer day, and like thousands of other teenagers across Kansas City, Fawn had spent most of it at work. She was employed at Worlds of Fun, where she worked behind a cash register, greeting guests and helping customers throughout the day. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest work, and every paycheck brought her one step closer to buying her first car. When her shift finally ended around 11 p.m., her mother, Beverly, and younger sister Felissa drove to pick her up. After a long day on her feet, Fawn looked exhausted. During the drive home, she barely spoke. There were no signs that anything was wrong, no indication that she felt threatened, no reason for anyone to believe this ordinary Tuesday night would become one of the darkest moments in the family's lives. Once they arrived home, Fawn headed upstairs almost immediately. She didn't stop to eat. She didn't stay up talking with her family. She simply wanted to get some sleep before returning to work the following day. Looking back, investigators would realize there were several details about the Cox home that made it especially vulnerable that night, not because the family had been careless, but because they lived the way most families did. They believed they were safe. Years earlier, one of Fawn's younger sisters had accidentally locked the family out of the house. To solve the problem, she climbed onto a nearby structure and crawled through one of the upstairs windows to unlock the front door from the inside. It worked so well that, over time, leaving those upstairs windows unlocked during the summer became routine. They provided fresh air during the hot nights and offered an easy way inside if someone was accidentally locked out again. It was a habit that seemed harmless for years. Outside, parked beneath those same windows, was John Cox's large orange work truck. To the family, it was simply another vehicle parked where it always sat. To someone with bad intentions, it could also serve as the perfect ladder. Inside the house, everyone settled into their normal routines. Because the home had only one aging air conditioning unit, John and Beverly slept downstairs where the cool air could reach them. Felissa chose to sleep nearby on the couch, because the upstairs bedrooms were almost unbearable in the July heat. Across the street, Amber was spending the night babysitting for neighbors, leaving Fawn alone in the upstairs bedroom she normally shared with her sister. There was one more detail investigators would later find especially significant. The lock on Fawn's bedroom door had been broken for some time. Unable to secure it properly, she had developed her own solution. Each night, before going to bed, she wedged a steak knife into the door frame, hoping it would prevent anyone from quietly opening the door while she slept. It wasn't a perfect security measure, but it gave her peace of mind. The fact that a 16-year-old felt the need to improvise a lock would later raise important questions for investigators. Sometime after midnight, the quiet inside the house was suddenly interrupted. The family's pregnant poodle began barking, not once, not twice, but repeatedly. The barking was loud enough to wake Felissa, who got out of bed and checked on the dog. Believing the animal was simply restless because of the pregnancy, she calmed it down before returning to sleep. No one imagined the dog might have been reacting to something, or someone, moving through the house. That moment would haunt the family for years. Could the dog have heard someone climbing through the upstairs window? Was an intruder already inside the house? Or had someone familiar entered so quietly that no one realized they were there? Those questions have never been answered with certainty. What investigators do know is that, sometime during those early morning hours, someone entered Fawn's bedroom. The attack was swift, violent, and devastating. Downstairs, the roar of the old air conditioner masked nearly every sound inside the house. John Cox was known to be an exceptionally heavy sleeper, and with the air conditioner running at full volume, there was little chance anyone would hear a struggle taking place upstairs. By the time the first rays of sunlight reached the neighborhood, the killer was already gone. But the most heartbreaking discovery was still hours away. At 9:30 the next morning, an alarm clock began ringing upstairs. It kept ringing, minute after minute. Fawn had never been someone who slept through her alarm. At first, her father assumed she had simply overslept after working a late shift. As he walked past her room on the way to the bathroom, he saw what appeared to be his daughter asleep beneath a blanket. Not wanting to disturb her, he quietly continued down the hall. Downstairs, however, Beverly couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The alarm had been ringing for far too long. She called for Felissa to go upstairs and wake her sister. Seconds later, a scream shattered the silence inside the Cox family home. Felissa had reached over to wake Fawn. Instead, she discovered that her sister had been dead for hours. Within minutes, police officers, paramedics, and investigators were rushing toward the house. What they believed would be a medical emergency quickly became something far more disturbing. It was no longer a rescue, it was a homicide investigation. As investigators sealed off the Cox family home, one thing became immediately clear. This wasn't a burglary that had turned violent. This was something far more personal. Inside Fawn's bedroom, detectives began documenting every inch of the scene before anything was moved. Crime scene technicians photographed the room from every angle, carefully preserving details that might later explain what had happened during the early hours of July 26, 1989. The medical examiner soon confirmed what the family already feared. Fawn Marie Cox had been sexually assaulted before being strangled to death inside her own bedroom. It was a brutal attack carried out against a 16-year-old girl who had gone to bed believing she was safe in her own home. As heartbreaking as the crime was, investigators immediately focused on the physical evidence left behind. Every fingerprint, every strand of hair, every fiber, every drop of biological evidence had the potential to identify the person responsible. One of the first things detectives noticed was that several household items had been removed from other parts of the home. A stereo system and a Nintendo console had been thrown into the yard below one of the upstairs windows, as though someone had intended to steal them, but never returned to collect them. Blankets had also been pulled from a closet and left scattered across the bedroom floor. At first glance, it looked like the work of a burglar interrupted before finishing the job, but the deeper investigators looked, the less that theory made sense. The killer hadn't simply wandered into the wrong room. Everything suggested that Fawn herself had been the target. Crime scene technicians recovered several critical pieces of evidence, including hairs that did not belong to Fawn, traces of blood, and biological material from her bed sheets. Today, DNA evidence is often the centerpiece of homicide investigations. But in 1989, forensic science was still in its early stages. Detectives could preserve the evidence, but they lacked the technology needed to identify the person who left it behind. Instead of producing a name, the evidence became something else entirely, a promise. A promise that if science ever advanced far enough, the truth might still be waiting. Investigators also discovered something that puzzled everyone involved. An army-style cap had been left inside Fawn's bedroom. No one in the Cox family recognized it. Friends couldn't identify it. Neighbors had never seen it before. Detectives believed it may have belonged to the killer, but despite years of investigation, the cap was never conclusively linked to any suspect. Even after the case was solved decades later, it remained one of the few pieces of evidence that was never fully explained. Another detail raised even more questions. Remember the steak knife Fawn had wedged into her bedroom door before going to sleep? Investigators found it at the scene. Whether the killer removed it before entering the room, or whether it was displaced during the attack, has never been fully established publicly. What it did reveal, however, was that Fawn had taken steps to protect herself before going to bed, making the attack even more tragic. Then detectives noticed something that would spark debate for decades. Fawn's bed sat on small wheels. Investigators believed that if she had struggled violently against her attacker, the bed should have rolled across the room. Instead, it remained surprisingly stable. That observation led some investigators to briefly wonder whether a second person had been present, someone holding the bed in place while another carried out the attack. It was only a theory, and no physical evidence ever confirmed it. In fact, only one person's DNA was ultimately connected to the assault. Still, at the time, detectives couldn't completely dismiss the possibility, and the question lingered for years. Perhaps the most important conclusion investigators reached wasn't based on DNA or fingerprints. It was based on familiarity. The person responsible appeared to know exactly how to enter the house without waking anyone. They knew about the upstairs windows. They knew where John Cox parked his large orange work truck, making it easier to climb to the second floor. They knew the family slept downstairs during the summer because of the single air conditioning unit, and they knew Fawn would likely be alone upstairs that night. Those weren't details a random stranger would normally know. To detectives, they pointed toward one unsettling possibility. The killer wasn't just someone who had watched the house. He was someone who already knew it. Someone who had been inside before. Someone the family may have trusted. Despite collecting every piece of evidence available, investigators still faced an enormous problem. They had no eyewitnesses, no surveillance cameras, no DNA database, no suspect they could conclusively place inside Fawn's bedroom. The evidence told detectives how the killer entered the house. It suggested why Fawn had been targeted, but it still couldn't answer the most important question of all: who did it? That answer wouldn't come from the crime scene. Instead, detectives would soon find themselves chasing a completely different theory, one that would lead to arrests, a shocking confession, and ultimately, another devastating dead end. Within days of Fawn Marie Cox's murder, detectives faced enormous pressure to identify the person responsible. A 16-year-old girl had been attacked inside her own bedroom, and the crime had shaken not only the Cox family but the entire Kansas City community. Investigators began by looking at everyone who could have had a connection to Fawn. Friends, classmates, co-workers, neighbors, and relatives were interviewed. Detectives also examined the surrounding neighborhood, where burglaries and gang activity had become an ongoing concern. At first, one theory seemed more convincing than any other. What if the murder had happened during a burglary? The evidence appeared to support that possibility. Electronics had been removed from the house and left outside beneath the upstairs window. It looked as though someone had intended to steal them before abandoning the plan. Combined with reports of criminal activity in the area, detectives began focusing on a group of local teenagers believed to have ties to recent break-ins. Then, just weeks after the murder, the investigation took what seemed like a major step forward. A witness came forward with information that investigators believed only someone connected to the crime could know. Based on that statement, police questioned 3 teenage suspects. One of them was eventually charged with first-degree murder, giving Fawn's family hope that justice might finally be within reach. But that hope didn't last. As detectives continued interviewing the suspects, one of the teenagers admitted that he had entered the Cox home on the night of the murder. He described climbing onto John Cox's orange work truck before making his way through the upstairs window. More importantly, he revealed details investigators had never released publicly. He even told police that he had thrown a tape recorder out of the window during the burglary, and that the handle had broken off when it hit the ground. He then directed detectives to the exact location where the broken piece had landed. When investigators searched the area, they found it exactly where he said it would be. There was no question that he had been inside the house. But there was a much bigger question. Was he also the killer? The teenager insisted he and the others had entered only to steal electronics. According to his account, they never entered Fawn's bedroom, never encountered her, and left without knowing a murder had taken place. Soon afterward, he withdrew his confession altogether. At the same time, forensic testing began undermining the prosecution's case. The fingerprints recovered from the scene didn't match any of the teenage suspects. More importantly, the biological evidence recovered from Fawn's bedroom didn't match them either. The witness whose testimony had driven the investigation also changed their story, admitting they had lied. Without reliable testimony or physical evidence linking the suspects to the murder, prosecutors had no choice but to dismiss the charges. Just like that, the investigation collapsed. For the Cox family, it was another devastating blow. After believing the case had finally been solved, they found themselves back at the beginning, with no arrests, no convictions, and no answers. Yet one mystery continued to trouble investigators. If those teenagers had really entered the house to steal electronics, when did the killer arrive? Had the murderer already been inside the home while the burglary was taking place? Did the killer enter through the same upstairs window after the burglars had left? Or were the two events somehow connected in a way detectives never fully understood? Those questions would remain unanswered for decades. What investigators did know was that none of the available evidence pointed to the teenagers as Fawn's killer. The DNA recovered from the crime scene belonged to someone else, someone whose identity remained completely unknown. With every promising lead exhausted, the case slowly lost momentum. Months turned into years. Years turned into decades. The evidence was carefully preserved, the case files were archived, and Fawn Marie Cox's murder became one of Kansas City's most frustrating cold cases. For many investigators, it felt as though the person responsible had disappeared without leaving a trace. What they couldn't know was that the most important piece of evidence had been sitting in storage all along. The technology needed to identify the killer simply hadn't been invented yet. When the charges against the teenage suspects were dismissed, the investigation into Fawn Marie Cox's murder came to a standstill. For detectives, the case became another unsolved homicide waiting for a new lead. But for the Cox family, there was no moving on. Every birthday, every holiday, and every family gathering served as another reminder that Fawn's chair would always remain empty. While investigators continued working other cases, her family carried the weight of unanswered questions every single day. John and Beverly Cox refused to let their daughter's name disappear. Over the years, they organized fundraisers, offered reward money, and appeared in countless interviews, hoping someone would finally come forward with the missing piece of the puzzle. They believed someone knew more than they were saying. Even if that person hadn't committed the crime, they hoped time would eventually convince them to speak. Their determination inspired others, but no tip ever led detectives to the killer. The years kept passing. By the early 2000s, forensic science had advanced dramatically. Detectives were finally able to develop a complete DNA profile from the biological evidence collected in 1989. It was a significant step forward, and investigators entered the profile into CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database. They waited for the notification every investigator hopes to receive. It never came. There was no match. That result told detectives something important. Whoever had murdered Fawn had either never been convicted of a qualifying crime, had never submitted DNA to the system, or had died before ever entering the database. Once again, the investigation reached another dead end. But one member of the Cox family refused to stop searching. Fawn's younger sister, Amber, became determined to keep the case alive. She spent years researching developments in forensic science, following cold cases from around the country, and studying how new DNA techniques were solving crimes that had once seemed impossible to crack. She also turned to the internet. Amber posted details about her sister's case on cold case forums, hoping someone might recognize a forgotten name or remember something investigators had missed. She responded to strangers, followed up on tips, and searched for answers long after many people assumed the case would never be solved. The emotional toll was enormous. Amber later admitted that the case consumed her life. She struggled under the weight of constantly replaying that night in her mind, wondering if anything could have been done differently. She wasn't just grieving the loss of her sister, she was living with decades of uncertainty. Still, she never stopped believing the truth was out there. As the 2010s began, another revolutionary tool started changing criminal investigations across the United States. Instead of comparing crime scene DNA only to convicted offenders, scientists discovered they could compare it to public genealogy databases built by ordinary people researching their family histories. It was an entirely different approach. Rather than searching for the killer directly, investigators searched for the killer's relatives, a distant cousin, a shared ancestor, a family tree. Cases that had remained unsolved for decades suddenly began producing answers. The arrest of the Golden State Killer proved just how powerful this new investigative method could be, and police departments across the country began revisiting cold cases once thought impossible to solve. Amber watched those headlines with cautious optimism. If genetic genealogy could identify killers in California, could it finally identify the person who murdered her sister? There was just one problem. The process was expensive, time-consuming, and required specialized forensic laboratories. Many police departments simply didn't have the funding to pursue it. For years, Fawn's case waited once again, not because detectives had stopped trying, but because the technology capable of solving the murder remained just out of reach. Then, in 2020, everything changed. Federal resources became available, allowing Kansas City detectives to submit one of their oldest cold cases for advanced genetic genealogy testing. For the first time in 31 years, investigators had a new lead, and this time, science was about to reveal what every witness, every interrogation, and every traditional investigative technique had failed to uncover. For more than 3 decades, the answer had been sitting inside an evidence locker. Detectives had the killer's DNA. They just didn't have his name. When Kansas City police received funding to revisit cold cases using advanced genetic genealogy, investigators knew Fawn Marie Cox's case had to be among the first submitted. Unlike traditional DNA testing, which compares evidence against known offenders in criminal databases, genetic genealogy works differently. It begins by asking a much broader question. Instead of looking for the killer, can investigators find one of the killer's relatives? Scientists extracted DNA from the biological evidence collected in Fawn's bedroom back in 1989 and sent it to Parabon Nanolabs, a forensic laboratory specializing in genetic genealogy. From there, experts began building a family tree using distant DNA matches from public genealogy databases. It wasn't an instant process. Every match represented another branch of a family tree that had to be researched by hand. Detectives compared birth records, marriage records, census data, obituaries, and family histories, slowly narrowing thousands of possible relatives into a much smaller group of potential suspects. Then, after months of work, one name rose to the top. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't one of the teenage burglary suspects, and it wasn't someone investigators had spent years chasing. It was someone who had been connected to the Cox family all along. Donald Lee Cox, Jr. He was 21 years old when Fawn was murdered. More importantly, he was her cousin. For detectives, the discovery suddenly explained details that had puzzled investigators since the very beginning. How did the killer know the upstairs windows were usually unlocked? How did he know John Cox's work truck was parked beneath the window? How did he know the parents slept downstairs during the summer? How did he know Fawn would likely be alone upstairs that night? Those weren't lucky guesses. Those were the kinds of details only someone familiar with the family's routines would know. Donald had visited the home many times over the years. He didn't need to force his way into an unfamiliar house. He already understood its layout, its routines, and the trust that existed inside it. But investigators still needed something stronger than a family tree. Genetic genealogy points detectives toward a suspect. It doesn't prove guilt. To close the case, investigators needed a direct DNA comparison. There was one problem. Donald Lee Cox, Jr. had died in 2006 from a drug overdose, 14 years before detectives identified him as their prime suspect. That meant they couldn't interview him, obtain a warrant for his DNA, or confront him with the evidence. At first, it seemed as though the investigation had reached another dead end. Then detectives discovered something remarkable. Because Donald's death had been investigated at the time, the medical examiner had preserved a blood sample during the autopsy. Although he had never been charged with Fawn's murder, that sample remained in storage. Investigators requested the sample and sent it for forensic comparison. The results left no room for doubt. The DNA profile developed from the biological evidence collected in Fawn's bedroom in 1989 matched Donald Lee Cox Jr.'s preserved blood sample. After 31 years, the mystery was finally over. For the Cox family, the answer brought two emotions at the same time: relief and heartbreak. Relief because they finally knew who had taken Fawn's life. Heartbreak because the person responsible wasn't an unknown predator. It was someone who had shared their last name, someone who had been welcomed into their home, someone who had attended family gatherings and stood alongside grieving relatives while the investigation unfolded. According to investigators, Fawn's parents later admitted they had privately wondered over the years whether Donald might somehow have been involved. But without evidence, they couldn't allow themselves to believe such an accusation against a member of their own family. Although Donald would never stand trial, detectives officially closed one of Kansas City's oldest unsolved murders. For investigators, it marked more than the end of a cold case. It proved that evidence collected decades earlier could still speak. That time doesn't always erase the truth, and that sometimes justice arrives long after everyone believes it never will. When Kansas City police officially announced that Fawn Marie Cox's murder had been solved, it marked the end of a 31-year investigation that had challenged generations of detectives. For the Cox family, however, the announcement was never about celebrating. It was about finally knowing the truth. For decades, they had lived with unanswered questions, wondering who had taken Fawn's life and why. While the DNA evidence finally provided the identity of the killer, it couldn't restore the years they had lost or erase the pain that had followed them since the summer of 1989. Because Donald Lee Cox Jr. had died in 2006, there would be no arrest, no courtroom, and no trial. The family would never hear him explain what happened that night, or answer the questions they had carried for more than 3 decades. Those answers died with him. Even so, investigators believed solving the case was important. It cleared away decades of speculation, eliminated the wrong suspects who had once fallen under suspicion, and gave the Cox family something they had been denied for years: certainty. The investigation had finally reached a conclusion based on scientific evidence rather than theories or assumptions. The case also highlighted just how dramatically forensic science has changed. When detectives collected DNA evidence in 1989, they had no way of knowing it would become the key to solving the case more than 3 decades later. Instead of allowing that evidence to be forgotten, investigators preserved it, believing that one day science might provide the answers they couldn't. That decision proved to be the turning point. Today, genetic genealogy continues to solve cold cases across the United States, identifying suspects who once believed they had escaped justice forever. Fawn Marie Cox's case stands as another reminder that even after decades, the truth can still come to light. But behind every scientific breakthrough is a family forced to live with unimaginable loss. Fawn wasn't simply a cold case. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a 16-year-old with plans for the future that were stolen in a single night. Although justice came too late for her to see, her case has helped demonstrate the value of preserving evidence and the importance of never giving up on unsolved investigations. Sometimes justice isn't measured by a conviction. Sometimes it's measured by finally giving a victim back their name, their story, and the truth. If you found this documentary informative, subscribe to Midnight True Crime and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. We cover the facts, follow the evidence, and bring you the latest developments in the cases that matter most. And before you go, we'd like to hear from you. What do you think is the biggest unanswered question in this investigation? Let us know in the comments below, and as always, please keep the discussion respectful. The headlines may fade, but the search for truth never ends. This is Midnight True Crime. We'll see you in the next investigation.